Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Insights webinar from the World Wellbeing Movement on how to boost employee well-being with the Work Wellbeing Playbook. My name is Sarah Cunningham, and I'm one of a number of co-authors of the Work Wellbeing Playbook. And I'm delighted and honoured to be joined here today by fellow co-authors, Dr. William Fleming and Cherise Regier, both of whom are research fellows with our academic partner, the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford, with whom we partnered to create this playbook. And I really want to thank Will and Cherise for joining us today. Both of them have an incredible wealth of knowledge around the academic literature into how to improve employee well-being. And indeed, they are contributing themselves to that growing field of literature with their own original research. So both of them separately have published papers this year, which you may well have read, and I know much more to come as well. So I'm really, really grateful. I also want to thank a few more people before we jump in. I want to thank the other co-authors of the playbook as well, Mika Katz, Dr. George Ward, and a particular thank you to Professor Jan Emmanuel Deneve, who is a co-founder of the World Wellbeing Movement and director of the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford. And again, thank you also to Indeed, the recruitment company Indeed, without whose support we wouldn't have been able to do this. Now, appreciation and recognition did not make the final cut in the vote of the three drivers that you wanted to present us on today, but they are really important drivers of our well-being at work. So I also want to say a special thank you to Jonathan Whitney and Charlotte Day, without whom today's event just would not be possible, and who do incredible work on comms and marketing for the World Wellbeing Movement. Now, I do want to get into it because we've a lot to cover. Please hold your questions until the end. There will be time for Q&A, we hope. We've all been asked to stick to time, but you can also see on your screen a Q&A icon. So you can type your questions in that throughout, and at the end, we'll do our absolute best to leave some time to get to those. Now, of course, we're here today to talk about the Work Wellbeing Playbook and share insights from it. So you can download this resource from the URL you see on screen. The playbook condenses insights from a comprehensive academic literature review looking at the interventions to improve employee well-being, and it condenses them into an accessible, easy to use format aimed at business leaders and recognizing how busy you all are. In creating this, we really wanted to provide business leaders with insights on how to craft a holistic work well-being strategy. And holistic really is the key word here. If you did see my colleague, Dr. William Fleming's paper go viral earlier this year, you will have seen that individual level interventions in isolation are simply not powerful enough to solve something as complex as improving employee well-being at scale. To achieve that, we need to take an organizational level approach. So the playbook categorizes interventions according to 12 drivers of employee well-being and offers interventions at organizational level, group level, and individual level. So when you click on this URL, it will take you to a landing page where you'll see the 12 drivers of employee well-being. But you will also see a section entitled Making the Most of This Resource. Step one, I highly recommend, should be to read this guidance, because if you read this section, it will really help you to get the most out of the playbook. I'm going to share a few insights from this, but a whistle-stop tour. So this will outline how to measure how your employees are feeling using the 4 science-based questions that we recommend. This comprises job satisfaction, evaluative well-being, happiness at work, and negative stress at work, which is positive and negative affect or emotion, and also sense of purpose, so eudaimonic well-being. But these questions will only tell you how your employees are feeling. They won't tell you anything about why they're feeling that way. To figure that out, you need to measure the drivers of employee well-being. And again, that's why we've categorized the playbook by 12 drivers of employee well-being. So measure those drivers and then pinpoint the poorest performing drivers at your organization and start rolling out the first interventions aimed at improving those drivers. Now, that was a whistle-stop tour of the guidance. Do please read it. There is more guidance in there, including the importance of supplementing that quantitative data with qualitative data, listening to your employees, launching and iterating, looking at the changes that this makes, and so forth. But of course, we're here to talk about the Work Wellbeing Playbook. There were 12 drivers. We don't have time to cover all 12 today. So we asked you to choose which 3 you wanted us to present on, which means I get to be like a reality TV host. And I get to say that the votes are in, the lines are closed, we've counted the votes and they have been verified by our independent adjudicator. And the 3 drivers that you wanted us to present on are, you can see the chart here, stress, inclusion and belonging, and purpose. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to my colleague, Dr. William Fleming, who will talk you through the interventions within the stress driver.
Thanks very much, Sarah, for that excellent kickoff. So as Sarah said, we're going to talk about 3 key drivers of workplace well-being, which people have shown the most interested in. And I've got the big one, really, which is stress. Now, of course, we talk about stress all the time, but I would say there are some common misconceptions around what stress actually is. When we talk about stress generally, we tend to talk about it as an emotion, as a subjective phenomenon. We might say we're stressed about something specific happening at that moment in our lives, or talk about work stress. It might be about a specific task, milestone, or relationship. However, in dominant academic theories, we tend to think of stress as a model. So stress is really the result of an imbalance between the demands that get placed on us at work and the resources that we have to cope with those demands. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't or don't feel stressed, but this is the subjective experience of this imbalance at work. So the job demands are the physical, psychological, social, and organizational aspects of a job that require physical, cognitive, or emotional effort. But then the job resources are what support us and allow us to exert that effort. And might be knowledge and expertise, colleagues, time, management, energy, and so on. So stress really is when there's an imbalance between the demands placed on us and resources. It doesn't match up. And if this is the case, we've got this imbalance, the stress, then that's going to negatively impact your well-being at work and beyond. But that's a pretty obvious point, I think. However, what's less obvious is what to do about it. And that's the big challenge and what we spent a long time reviewing the literature to provide answers to. Probably the most common approach these days. Oh, I'm supposed to say next slide. There we go. Yeah, thanks. So probably the most common approach these days takes an individualized approach. So organizations might mainly offer a stress management course for individuals to attend. And these courses often have the aim of developing resilience or emotional management skills, trying to help individuals cope better with stress. That's only seen as sort of an individual phenomenon. But early in the year, Sarah actually briefly mentioned it, I published a paper evaluating various individualized interventions like this and really found that these initiatives aren't effective for improving well-being. These practices mainly try and change the worker and not the workplace. So today I'll try and talk about some interventions that will, but it's more what I'm going to be talking about is actually a process. So the first step in this process really is to identify stressors in your organization. As Sarah said, only by identifying, understanding, tracking, and then subsequently minimizing stressors can you really help employees thrive. But to identify stressors, you do need sort of an effective measurement process in place. You could call it a stress audit, and there are lots of common tools available. For example, the UK's Health and Safety Executive, they've got their management standards indicator tool. And it's focused around the same model of stress I've just outlined, so job demands and resources. It focuses on 6 dimensions. The job demands, your control over your job, so how, when, and where it's done, the support you receive from management, as well as money and time, relationships, how well defined the job role is and how trained you are for it, and also change, how that's managed in an organization. The HSE tool is quite a quick one, but there are also longer stress tools, like in the slides here, signposted to the asset stress screening tool. But then we can also recommend the Indeed to Work Wellbeing survey. So yeah, Indeed helps support the playbook, and they've got a quick sort of micro survey with 12 drivers that that drive workplace wellbeing, and even a quick tool like that can help understand the main stresses in your workplace. But no, too soon. But yeah, really, so there are lots of tools, but really it's about just taking a concerted effort to understand what the problems are in your organization. And this also includes qualitative approaches. So if you maybe do focus groups or interviewing people and just really trying to understand the job. So it's about the key challenge here is to identify the stressors. And actually, so even just by identifying stressors, there's actually a study that shows even this can bring some benefits, with employees feeling more involved, listened to, and as though action is being taken to mitigate the biggest harms. Now we can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the first step is, so measuring and identifying stressors, but that's probably a little bit obvious, and you probably already do it to some extent with engagement or wellbeing surveys or, stress audits, however you do it. I'm sure many of you implement data collection processes to sort of identify harms and the biggest promoters of wellbeing as well. But what I want to move on now is a more radical approach, and I'll talk about this in 2 ways. So the first is around this idea of job crafting. Some of you might have heard this before, but maybe not have too much of an idea about it, but it's been around for a number of decades now. And really what it means is giving employees the autonomy to proactively shape their work tasks and relationships to better align with personal needs, goals, and skills. The first step is what I've just highlighted, which is identifying conditions that hinder well-being or productivity that we've already mentioned. But the second key step is allowing employees themselves to come up with solutions which respond to these harms or these blockers to doing your job effectively. Several studies show the effectiveness of job crafting practices. It can reduce work stress, but it also gives people more control over their jobs, increases their voice, and it's all about increasing autonomy over how people do their own job. And this can allow them to do their job in a better fashion. For example, we link here to one study, public service workers and those who are able to craft their jobs and have autonomy over it were much more likely to have work-life balance, be more engaged, and have lower risk of burnout. And this is sort of regardless of who they are. So it's not a universal intervention, but it's a universal process. Next slide, please. So job crafting is one way to look at this process of identification and solution. The other is to think about in terms of work redesign, which is very similar, but it's a bit more relational, so involves more people. Job crafting is typically just done by the individual, but when we talk about work redesign, really we mean involving managers, whether supervisors, senior leaders, or people in HR or colleagues, as well as employees doing jobs where we're implementing this process of improvement. And the idea is collaboratively to identify problems and come up with relevant and practical solutions. It might be small issues around stress or blockers to getting your job done efficiently, but it allows. Really, it's about developing a sort of collaborative goal of improving the organization. And this approach where managers buy in and employees are involved, this is how we start moving towards complex and system change interventions. As with all of our recommendations in our playbook, there's tons of academic evidence out there. For example, one review of 33 intervention studies found, both employee well-being and performance to be improved through work redesign practices. This might be improved through relevant training or improved feedback and performance systems, or changing how the bureaucracy works and the work tasks that people are scheduled to do. There's even some cases where work redesign process has been implemented and the interventions that come out at the end haven't been implemented successfully, but even just the process can bring benefit to people because there's a concerted effort to trying to improve workplaces. Next slide, please. How am I doing for time? Okay, good. So key reason really why job crafting and work design is so effective is because it's about including employees in workplace decision making. So ultimately, it's about giving employees a voice. So giving employees opportunity to participate in decisions and allowing ideas and concerns to influence workplace change. That's a key strategy that we can adopt for reducing stress and trying to improve well-being. It's especially important when implementing new interventions or relating to anything under health and well-being, so that it's actually responding to people's needs and challenges. In one study that we linked to here, an RCT of a participatory problem-solving workshop showed that those who engaged had fewer sick days and improvements in mental health, including stress symptoms. And another study that evaluated across multiple workplaces in Denmark showed participatory programs where workers were involved in decision-making brought improved working conditions and well-being. So the key aim consistently here is to involve people who do the jobs in decisions about how they're conducted. And this sort of focus on work-life balance is often where work redesign and job crafting interventions lead to. People want more autonomy over when and where they can complete their job. And really, employees should have flexibility and control of their schedules. Sure, most of you have a variety of hybrid, flexible working programs, but really it's about consulting the workforce on important dimensions of these policies. I also might not really about the wider working hours, or number of days spent in the office or online at home. It might be more related to the day-to-day schedule. So, for example, in one study of hotel cleaners, there was a piece of technology that designated which rooms were to be cleaned by sending the cleaners up and down the stairs with little regards where they were in the hotel. So then the employees with the manager and the people who ran the software, they got together to make sure that the room delegation was scheduled to avoid climbing upstairs, and so that everybody could work as a team. In a study here of workers in South Korea, those that had schedule control and work-life balance, is associated with job satisfaction and mental well-being, and stronger when employees have both flexibility and control over their schedule. Next slide. So this is my last point here, as I'm got about a minute left on my section. What I've been talking about is a process here to involve everybody doing the jobs in how to improve them. But there's sort of slightly different step, which is about involving managers and leaders in this process. Most of my ideas sort of come against an individualistic model of interventions, saying, oh, stress management program for someone is not going to help. And I do maintain this. But one area that the evidence does suggest is beneficial is that these kind of mental health and stress programs are beneficial for managers, and this has trickle-down benefits for their direct reports. So managers might have better awareness of stress, job demands, resources, improved awareness, and these, as a result, they'd be more likely to support those that they're supervising. So yeah, the systematic review of leadership studies, which really emphasizes the importance of leaders who have high well-being and fewer sick-related absence, and this relates to the more junior employees as well. And in another study of fire departments in Australia, actually delivering stress training to the managers and the leaders actually reduced absenteeism among frontline firefighters. So that's the sort of final intervention there. So hopefully I've been able to at least introduce and explain some of these ideas around job crafting, work design, and employee involvement. And yeah, that's really the key point I want to get across is including people in the process to identify stressors and coming up with tailored solutions to the problems. What this looks like will be different in different contexts. And there's not going to be a single solution, magic bullet, or off-the-shelf product that we can recommend, but instead I'm here recommending a process. So I'll hand over to Cherise now, who's going to talk about purpose and work. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Will. So thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I'm going to be discussing purpose. So purpose can be a powerful motivator in the workplace that allows people to feel a sense of meaning in their job and just their broader working life. In the academic literature, we often call this eudaimonic well-being. And it's not only an input into workplace well-being or a driver, as we like to call it, but it can also be considered an outcome or indicator of well-being. So building off of Will's presentation, increasing one's sense of purpose can reduce their experience of stress in the workplace. So it almost acts as a buffer or a resource that allows ones to manage their work demands more efficiently or just better in general. So purpose promotes workplace engagement, productivity, and satisfaction. And leaders who improve employees' sense of purpose can help them understand both their strengths and how their work contributes to the broader organizational mission. So the first intervention category that I want to discuss is this idea of highlighting the pro-social elements of work. So what is pro-social behavior? It's simply a behavior that's intended to benefit other people. So it's usually voluntary. So you could think of it as an expression of goodwill, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. The job itself might be pro-social in nature. You could think of social work or professions in the healthcare industry as pro-social in nature. So how might this translate into the workplace? Well, causal evidence shows that pro-social task framing, which is essentially highlighting the pro-social elements of work, will increase one's sense of purpose and in turn well-being, but it also has a positive impact on job performance. And there's causal evidence in the academic literature to show this. So the key mechanism at play is that employees experience their job as more strongly related to other people. And this is through heightened perceptions of social impact and social worth. So the question becomes then, how can we cultivate this more like practically in the workplace? So for those who have a job that is already pro-social in nature, you'll want to emphasize the positive impact that they have on others regularly and get specific. So for example, reading your team a customer review or a patient review or even a client review has been shown to increase one's sense of purpose. One experiment showed that fundraising callers who read stories about how the work of former callers was beneficial to scholarship students more than doubled the number of weekly pledges that they earned and the amount of weekly donation money that they raised 1 month later. So those are pretty, significant results just from being able to highlight the positive impact that one's work is having on other people. And so for those whose work may not be as pro-social oriented by nature, it's important to identify indirect ways in which their work may benefit others. So, and in both cases, encourage new pro-social behavior by recognizing those who engage in it, but you can also do this by offering volunteer work opportunities. So there's a growing body of literature evidencing the positive impact of volunteering to one's well-being. There's some organizations that actually have a specific type of leave for the purpose of volunteering, which is a really creative way to get people to take up volunteering. And leadership will play a big role in this, of course. And moving on to the next category. So this is taking a strengths-based approach to managing your employees. So I think it's quite obvious to most of us that when we engage in activities that we are good at, we tend to feel quite joyful when we're doing it. In fact, people often report a sense of mastery, personal growth, and most importantly, this idea of purpose when they're utilizing their strengths. So the evidence base for this strength use benefiting personal and workplace well-being is very strong. So this approach can lower stress, it can enhance self-esteem, and improve vitality and positive emotions. So you could think of just the idea of being happy. Individuals who use their strengths at work are more engaged in their jobs, And all of these more engaged and more productive. And so this will have positive impacts on performance, turnover, recruitment, etc. So considering all of this, it's important to discuss how this can be operationalized in the workplace. So on a high level, 2 critical steps are needed. The first is helping employees identify what their strengths actually are, because many of us don't really know. And then the second is providing them with opportunities to utilize their strengths or leverage their strengths at work. And this is often achieved by embedding it into their daily work. And so Will talked about job design and job crafting. So that is a great way to do this. And so you want to think about, or there's, 4 kind of ways in which it can be embedded into work. Self-concordant goals. So that is goals that are personally interesting and meaningful. Because strengths represent a person's authentic self and are in themselves intrinsically motivating, goals that are congruent with one's strengths are motivating and enjoyable. So it might be a goal setting exercise with your team that could encourage this effect. Job crafting. So this refers to efforts by employees to change the way they do their job, what they do and who with, and how they perceive their job. So as more or less in line with their values. Research has found that employees who craft their jobs to be more in line with their passions, interests, and values, i.e. their authentic strengths, find more meaning, enjoyment, and satisfaction in their work. And these are all fundamental aspects of well-being. The third is the idea of flow. So applying strengths, which can incite feelings of invigoration and excitement, a yearning for the activity to continue, and a sense that the activity is worth doing for its own sake, is an important kind of idea of this flow state that I'm sure many of you have heard of. So flow is basically a highly enjoyable and intrinsically motivating state of mind. And it stems from being fully absorbed in an activity. So in particular, research has found that flow can arise from activities that represent an optimal balance between one's unique skills. So that would be akin to their strengths and the amount of challenge in a given activity, giving rise to this positive effect and satisfaction. And the fourth area is relationships. So they're another important route through which strengths can be meaningfully applied. So close relationships, especially at work, can provide a supportive social environment where a person can meet their intrinsic psychological needs, thereby allowing for optimal growth and well-being. Many strengths of character are other focused. So for example, the character strengths of love, forgiveness, gratitude, and kindness are often actualized through interactions with others, which in turn can enhance well-being. So a randomized control trial of a 6-week program administered to Australian government employees was designed to capture all 4 of these mechanisms to enhance well-being. And the employees who successfully completed the program actually showed significant gains in subjective well-being and work-related well-being over time. But the effects were more pronounced for general well-being. And researchers believe this to be because participants ended up applying their strengths outside of work, so in their personal lives, more than they actually did at work. So that highlights, a potential opportunity to improve this intervention, which would be to do a better job at sort of translating strengths into the job. And on-the-job support is really critical for realizing the benefits of this approach. So again, that transfer of training is critical. And I do also want to note that attrition was an issue within this study. So when I say attrition, it's just dropout rate. So, and it often is with every kind of wellness, workplace well-being intervention, similar to how Will alluded to when we focus on these individual type interventions, you do run that risk. And so if you are going to implement something of this nature, figuring out how to motivate employees to complete the program or just embedding these activities into the daily workflow is a more optimal approach. Okay, next slide. So I'm not going to really speak too much on job crafting because I spoke about it in the previous intervention. And as you'll see, is like a lot of these interventions are interconnected. But I do just want to highlight the 3 types of job crafting. There's task crafting, which is altering the type, scope, sequence, and number of tasks that an employee does. There's relationship crafting, which is altering work-related social interactions. So that might be allowing your employees to decide who they work with for specific projects. And then there's perspective crafting, which is altering one's perceptions of work. And so that might be connected to the first intervention I talked about, which was the idea of like pro-social task framing. Moving on to the next slide. Okay, and then this also connects to this strengths-based approach, which is building reflection into the workplace flow. So as I noted, kind of one of the critical steps to the strengths-based approach was helping your employees identify what their strengths are. So this is very similar in the sense that getting employees to reflect can be very empowering, and it keeps purpose top of mind by helping employees set goals. It generates energy in the workplace and it reduces stress. So a randomized control trial of a 2.5-day immersive workshop designed to help employees align with their sense of purpose, increase their daily energy levels, and improve their overall quality of life. And this led to significant improvements in participants' self-reported general health, mental health, and social functioning in the short and long term. Okay, and then moving on to the final intervention category for purpose. So this is connecting work to the organizational mission. So looping back to this kind of importance of leadership that I highlighted at the top, cultivating a sense of purpose among your employees, it really should be a top-down approach. Organizations with a clear mission and leaders who are able to effectively connect employees' work to that mission are going to generate a greater sense of purpose. And so I really encourage all of you to read this reference in particular. It's an in-depth historical analysis of President John F. Kennedy's leadership of NASA in the 1960s when he put the first man on the moon. And so it's just a really exciting and entertaining read, especially for academic literature, which is not often the case. But I just wanted to kind of highlight these 4 specific things that Kennedy did that really motivated people to get this man on the moon, essentially. One was, having an organizational mission and, making it simple, clear, and concrete. The second is translating that organizational mission, into concrete objectives. So that's really sort of operationalizing it to the next stage. Third is connecting employees' daily work to those concrete objectives. So again, that's where like managers of teams come in. And then the fourth is inspiring employees using rhetorical language. And so I think language always is an important component of strong leadership. But in this case, it is especially. And so emphasizing communication is key, and setting up multiple channels for communication to continue to reiterate the organizational mission and how one's daily work activities might connect to that mission. And so one way you could think about doing this is some sort of brainstorming session with your team. It might be developing like a theory of change model where, okay, this is our ultimate objective and what are the different steps that are required to get to that ultimate objective. And like, this is where we fit in, our team fits in. We're contributing to this specific component that is moving us forward to that mission. All right, moving on to Sarah, who's going to talk to you about inclusion and belonging.
Thank you so much, Cherise, and thank you, Will, as well. I wanted to talk about inclusion and belonging. I was really interested to see that this was the second most popular driver in the vote. And that tallies with the what the data and what the research is showing us. So my colleagues, Professor Jan Emmanuel Deneve and Dr. George Ward, have been doing a lot of work with the world's largest study of employee well-being. That's the Indeed Work Wellbeing Survey. So they've analysed data from over 20 million employee responses to this survey from employees from thousands of companies. And there's an awful lot of really rich insights that they've generated. But one of them is that belonging is not only a hugely important driver of our well-being at work, but actually a disproportionately large driver when compared with the other drivers. And yet it's often overlooked. Now, of course, diversity, inclusion are prerequisites for belonging. And inclusion, of course, is also a very strong driver of our well-being at work. I know that there are many people tuning in who work in this area and who have an expertise in this area, but to bring everybody to the same page, I want to very quickly share some definitions. So diversity describes the demographic breakdown of a group. Inclusion is the degree to which groups are heard and involved in organizational processes and decisions. And belonging is when people feel accepted, secure, and supported, and that they can be their authentic selves, which I've just been in telling you that there is construction going on next door, but the good news is it seems to have stopped. So I am working remotely today. It is only by combining all three, diversity, inclusion, equity, and belonging, that organizations really reap the benefit. And there is a really strong business imperative for driving inclusion and belonging in the workplace. I know I'm very much preaching to the choir here, so I won't spend long on this slide in the interest of time, but there are several studies, several high-end studies that demonstrate that if you can drive a diverse workforce with an inclusive culture where employees feel a sense of belonging, you can increase creativity, innovation, productivity. And that stands to reason, because if we're all the same, we're likely going to come up with quite similar ideas. And much more worryingly, it's also likely that we might make the same mistakes. So it really does go without saying. But beyond diversity, inclusion, every employee feeling that they have a voice, that they can critique, is going to lead to better outcomes. And what's interesting looking at the research is this is the case across industries. So you can see the final example shared on this slide is even in the military. But I want to get on to some of the academic interventions. Now, diversity and inclusion are essential prerequisites to drive a sense of belonging. So really, you've got to start at the very beginning of the process, which in the workplace is the hiring and promotions processes. And we all know that as human beings, we do have unconscious biases. And of course, the risk is that this could lead us to unintentionally make discriminatory hiring or promotion decisions. And that can be because of implicit stereotype associations, such as the representativeness heuristic, which is associating certain stereotypes or traits with a particular job, or potentially affinity bias, which is being drawn to people who are similar to us. So what you're seeing on this slide are a number of interventions aimed at minimizing the impact of unconscious bias, and it's minimizing it. You know, it's not something that really the literature hasn't come up with a way to eradicate altogether. The first one is more focused on gender diversity, but of course there are many types of diversity. But a study by Goucher et al. Looked at words used within a job description. And they highlighted that gender stereotyped job adverts actually repel female candidates from applying. So it's an interesting paper because they've actually listed some what they call male-coded words. These are words like assertive, ambitious, competitive, independent. We see in more recent job adverts, particularly a few years ago in technology companies, you started seeing adverts for ninjas or rock stars. The advice here is to avoid those male-coded words in your job descriptions and aim for gender-neutral words. Now, the next intervention goes beyond gender to also support diversity within sort of ethnicity, etc. And that's to anonymize CVs or anonymize resumes to overcome stereotyping. Because, of course, we can reveal quite a lot of information from a name. The origin of this intervention is actually in blind orchestra auditions. So the study, the Golden and Rouse study, the researchers simply put a curtain between an auditionee and a judging panel. And the addition of that curtain, which meant the judging panel couldn't see the person auditioning, increased the selection of female musicians by 30%. Now, that obviously has its limitations, but several studies have taken that concept and applied it to perhaps the corporate world in terms of anonymizing the CV. There are limitations, of course, because it's not just our names that can reveal insights into our demographic. Our hobbies can, where we went to school or university, geography can. There are now companies out there who've developed software that can anonymize CVs, including hobbies and schooling, etc. Diversity training for hiring managers. Now, Will talked about the fact that group level interventions, particularly supporting people managers, can be effective. I do think it's important to note a limitation here, which is the research into unconscious bias training has highlighted that sort of one-off unconscious bias training is pretty ineffective. If you want your unconscious bias training to be effective, you need refresher training and you need other supportive structures like some of the nudges and interventions I'm talking through here. We talked about anonymizing CVs. Once you get to interview stages, there are other techniques you can apply. Work sample tests or cognitive ability tests. There's good evidence into these, particularly in later stages of the hiring process. Now, some interventions are more suited to certain job types. So in this scenario, software developers, quality assurance developers, graphic designers, copywriters, work sample tests might be more suitable. I'm going to go to the final one on this slide, which is the use of an interview scorecard that follows clearly defined metrics or traits. So this actually, the origin of this one is the late Daniel Cunningham, of course, the Nobel economist prize winner. And again, this really just brings us back to rational thinking to try and overcome those unconscious biases. So these should help to drive diversity within the organization. To drive inclusion, employee agency and employee voice is key. And this is something that Will has already started to talk about, but it really is so important. There's an interesting study here, the Brimhall study, which was a longitudinal study in a US not-for-profit hospital. The name of the study, I think, is quite interesting. The name of the study is Inclusion is Important, but how do I include? And so they looked at what leaders can do to create inclusive environments and really looked at the importance of driving inclusion by ensuring diverse team members have a voice. So again, employee agency is so important. Now, it's also important in decisions, and in the interest of time, I'm going to go on to this slide. By the way, the playbook is available online, and all of the studies you can dive into that way. But employee voice is also essential when it comes to the decision of where we work. So the research does tell us that hybrid working is optimal for our well-being and for productivity as well. However, that effect diminishes when employees are mandated to come in on particular days. So for flexible working to be effective, the research tells us that actually employees being involved in the decision making around that and having voice is important. Again, it's probably fairly obvious, but I think it is really important to note that there are certain demographics or certain groups of people who will benefit more from remote working, many groups of which have been unfortunately excluded for far too long from the traditional workplace. So whether that's people with a disability, whether that's carers of elderly relatives or young children, whether that's members of the neurodiverse community, which now accounts for about 15 to 20% of the workforce, according to latest analysis. So enabling remote working is really important, but research says that extra measures need to be put in place to support those who are working remotely, particularly in a hybrid environment. So a study, it's the study by Harrington and Emmanuel, looked back at 2018. It was a Fortune 500 call center, and looked at employees who had opted to work remotely. And they saw that their productivity went up. So they identified there is probably a bit of a self-selection bias in employees who opt to work remotely, that they have the self-discipline to be able to drive themselves. Work hours also went up. So measures need to be put in place to prevent excessive overtime and to prevent burnout, because job demands is an important driver of our well-being at work. The other risk for remote workers is that they can be overlooked for promotion. And in this particular study, despite remote workers' productivity being improved, they were still less likely to be promoted by 12 percentage points. And that's due to the availability heuristic, which is that when we're making decisions, we tend to use the most readily available or salient information to make those decisions. So if you're a team leader and you have 2 team members in the office with you every day and 2 team members working remotely, really you need to make sure that you're putting measures in place to ensure you are keeping track of your remote workers and promoting them as well. Now, before I go off this slide, I just want to highlight that hybrid working, remote working is important. The physical office still has a place. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that there is diversity of home circumstance. So while people living alone might prefer to go into the office, maybe people living in a crowded flat share might prefer to have an office to go into. Where that is the case, there is research into how to build inclusion, diversity, and a sense of belonging into the office decor. So for instance, employees who are neurodiverse, it's important to have quiet areas where they can go for focused work and not be surrounded by noise and noise cancellation headsets, and neutral decor. Bright clashing primary colors really does feed our senses. There's also research around the importance of biophilic design, so mirroring nature and bringing nature indoors. Now, I've gone into some interventions that are not in the playbook, but you will find them in this article. It's a blog I wrote. You'll find it on the World Wellbeing Movement website under the Thought Leadership section. And the other thing, just to highlight quickly, we talked about the importance of employee voice and employee agency. That's also critical for driving psychological safety in the workplace. Psychological safety is defined as feeling free, feeling safe to share your ideas, to voice your concerns and your critique without fear of recrimination. There's also a podcast with the leading authority on psychological safety, Professor Amy Edmondson, which is available on our Working on Wellbeing podcast.